Okay, hi everybody, thank you for coming. I'm sorry a little late today. As always, we are praying for the victory of our Chayolim in all the fronts of the war, the lasting unity of the people of Israel, and for all of those whose health has been affected by the war, and of course for the safe return of all of the hostages that are still alive. In addition, the shir is sponsored by Dr. David Weisskopf, thank you, in honor of families that suffer from parental alienation, as well as a refuah shlema for Yechiel Aryeh ben Ruth and Sarah Miriam bat Nechama. Let me just say a few words about parental alienation. I hope that none of you have any first-hand experience with it, but if either you do or you're aware of it, it is a very, very, very serious and tragic problem with drastic repercussions, not only for the spouses, but more importantly even for the children and their emotional well-being. This simply means that when there are divorces, which are tragic, but they sometimes have to happen, and the Torah allows for it, when one parent kind of tries to brainwash the other parent in demonizing that person, often with false accusations, that can poison the relationship of a child with their mother or with their father. It is an awful, awful, awful thing. One has to know that even if a husband and a wife cannot live together as husband and wife, they have a moral, religious, halachic responsibility as parents to do what is best for their children, and to use children as a pawn in whatever unresolved conflicts husbands or ex-husbands, ex-wives have with each other is really a crime against humanity. It's a crime against children. So it is something that's worthwhile to speak about, the notion of parental alienation. I know there was a suggestion, I'm sorry, you have to remind me, you wanted to connect it to Miriam, just remind me of the association now.
What's the problem with speaking Lashon Hara within the family?
Oh, okay. So at least a little bit of an analogy can be seen in the Parsha itself, the end of Parsha Behaloscha, where you remember that Miriam speaks truthful Lashon Hara, negative statements about her brother Moshe, and she speaks to Aaron. And by the way, the Lashon Hara is about Moshe being separated from his wife. And Miriam, who was an extremely righteous and saintly person, was immediately punished because, in addition to the general sin of Lashon Hara, driving a wedge in the shalom that exists in the family is an extra level of aveira that HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not tolerate. So, although parental alienation was not the issue there, but it does remind us of the great, grave consequences of sowing divisiveness within the family unit. So, as I say, my bracha is that none of you or your children should ever face these particular issues, but they do exist in the real world, and I thank Dr. Weisskopf for bringing it to our attention and having us think about this in a positive way. I myself am a lawyer, although I don't practice law, but I do want to accuse my profession of contributing to this in some way, because often it happens to be that many divorce attorneys are very, very aggressive, and they feel that the way they'll be successful to help their client is by demeaning and abusing the other side. So in a sense, I'm not going to blame all lawyers. Certainly that's not true, but the legal community bears a certain amount of blame for the parental alienation that is so prevalent. I'm familiar with it more in the United States. I am actually familiar with a number of cases, but I gather it exists here as well. Okay, in addition, Aliyat Neshamaot, Yonatan Israel Ben David, the brother of Chaya Feingold. Yonatan Israel Ben David Moshe, the brother of Chaya Feingold, number one. Number two, for the parents of Mike Klien, in memory of mom and dad, Joanne and Judah Klein. Number three, for the mother of Alya Ackerman, Sima bas Moshe HaLevi, who had the zchus to raise and now leave behind 7 amazing shomer mitzvot committed to Torah life grandchildren. That is a great accomplishment indeed. Finally, YIBONEH is turning to you to help facilitate the purchase of more sets of tefillin for the courageous soldiers who have requested them. Due to the major call-up of the reserves, the Miluim, there has been an uptick in requests for tefillin. At present, we have received additional requests now for 15 pairs, and the requests keep coming. One can contribute via the website and send a memo that the donation is for the Army Tefillin Fund. This is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. It's an opportunity to create Ahavas Yisrael. It's an opportunity to assist people in doing tshuva, returning to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I mean, imagine people who might be chiloni. That's why they don't have their own pair of tefillin. And they want to wear tefillin. I mean, how can we in good conscience not respond to the call of someone who is asking for an opportunity to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu in that way? And of course, as Ma'aminim, we certainly believe that the spiritual mitzvot will bring siyata d'shmaya in the military effort as well. So it's a matter of national security. It's not just the chesed and the tshuva, but in fact, we're protecting Am Yisrael by getting involved in this. So once again, yasher koach to YIBONEH for creating a tefillin fund, and may you be zocheh to have even more and more demands that will have to be met, because every demand is a turn towards tshuva. Now, somebody sent me a poll. I don't know if you saw this poll. Frankly, I don't believe it, although I hope that it's true. That in the age group of 18 to 29, I think that was the age group, a majority of Israelis between the ages of 18 and 29 are fully shomer Shabbos. Is that possibly true? The survey says that's what it is. I cannot believe it. But if it is true,
is that from CNN?
fake news, who knows? But that was the poll somebody sent me, that it was a poll that said the majority in that particular age group, 18 to 29, surveying the entire population of Israel, not just Haredi, or obviously including everybody, the population as a whole, are now shomer Shabbos. That is amazing news, although, again, I have to admit the cynic in me has trouble believing it, but, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that I'm just being cynical, and I will be proven wrong, B'ezras Hashem. That's a wonderful, wonderful sign, and as somebody said, maybe it's an example of the old adage of no atheists in foxholes, meaning in an eighth sarah, people do turn to Hashem under those circumstances. Okay, so we had a long introduction today, but now let's get into the Parsha a little bit. I'm going to really start at the very beginning of the Parsha. The beginning of the Parsha is Hashem commands Aaron that he is given, the Kohen Gadol is given a special mitzvah of lighting the menorah in the Mishkan, later in the Beis HaMikdash. And it's interesting that although the Mefarshim ask a question, it's interesting that the daily lighting of the menorah actually does not require a Kohen. Not only do you not need a Kohen Gadol, that for sure you don't need a Kohen Gadol, you don't even need a Kohen Hedjot. You don't even need a regular Kohen. Hadlakas HaMenorah is one of the few services in the temple that can be done by a non-Kohen. Now, there is a logistical problem, because the menorah is located inside of the Mishkan building, or in the Beis HaMikdash, inside of the Heichal, and a non-Kohen is not allowed to enter the Heichal. So how could a non-Kohen light the menorah if he can't even enter the Heichal? So the Rambam says he can use a long stick as a wick, meaning to say he has a long stick, like a 10-foot thin pole, and he ignites it, and he stands outside of the Heichal and sticks the stick in there. So halachically, you don't need a Kohen at all. Hadlaka is kosher bezor. There's an interesting halachic anomaly, though, because in lighting the menorah, there's actually two different mitzvos that have to be done every day. There is what is called hatovas haneros. Hatovas haneros is preparing the lamps, replacing the new oil, new wicks, and that's done prior to the hadlaka. Hadlaka is done in late afternoon. Hatava is actually done in the morning. It's not done right before it. And these are two separate mitzvahs. Now, what's a little strange is Hadlokas Haneros could even be done by a non-Kohen. Hatovas haneros can only be done by a Kohen, not a Kohen Gadol, and I'll get to that. Even there, you don't need Kohen Gadol, but you need a Kohen. Now, at first glance, this halacha seems a little peculiar, because we would normally view hatova as simply a preliminary activity to lighting, meaning the mitzvah is to light, but automatically I got to prepare the oil and put in the wicks. We would call that a hechsher. A hechsher means a preparation for a mitzvah. The actual purpose of the mitzvah is to light a menorah every night, late afternoon, and it would burn through the night. So the question would be, why would the Torah impose greater requirements for the preliminary activity, i.e. you need a Kohen, and it does not impose such a requirement for the main activity, which is hadlakas haneros? So there's actually, the Bali Musar say, there's actually a significant, important lesson here, and that is, sometimes it is the preparation that you bring to a good deed that is even more important than the actual good deed itself. Because the preparation involves your commitment, your care, your passion. The good deed, once everything is set, it's like, that's the final thing. So the final thing, anybody can do. But all of the preparation is very significant. This is something important, I think, for husbands sometimes, when we make siyumim for daf yomi or, big celebrations. So we sometimes forget all of the infrastructure that went in to enabling people to learn, the home environment and the like. But remember that the preparation of the candles might even be more important than the lighting of the candles itself. And that's kind of a remez here. Okay, but be it as it may, the question I want to raise is simply a very simple question. In the beginning of Parshat Behaloscha, the mitzvah of lighting the menorah is given to Aaron the Kohen. Problem is, halachically that's not so. Either way, it's not so. The actual lighting could be done by a non-Kohen, and even the hatavat haneros can be done by a Kohen, but it's not miyuchad to the Kohen Gadol. So why does the Torah seem to indicate that hadlakas hamenorah is a function of Kohen Gadol? So the Seporno says a very fascinating idea. The Seporno says that even though halachically lighting the menorah does not require a Kohen, and certainly not a Kohen Gadol, but for the 40 years the Jewish people were in the desert, the Kohen Gadol had to do it, because the entire 40 years had the status of a Yom Kippur. Now, I don't mean they had to fast. Obviously, they didn't fast. They ate man. But it means on Yom Kippur, we know there's a special rule that the divine services have to be done by the Kohen Gadol, including menorah, and says the Seporno that the holiness of the Mishkan in those 40 years was equal to Yom Kippur, and therefore the Yom Kippur rules applied to lighting the menorah. That's a chiddush of the Seporno. If you remember, I don't want to repeat this at length, when we looked at Parshas Acharei Mos in Vayikra, that gives the Yom Kippur service, if you remember, I shared with you a thought in the name of the Vilna Gaon, that since it doesn't mention, it describes the whole order of going to the Holy of Holies, but it doesn't mention Yom Kippur till the end. And the Vilna Gaon actually says, for the 40 years of the desert, Aaron could do the Yom Kippur service any day he wanted, and thereby gain entry into the Kodesh HaKodashim. It's only L'Dorot that this is limited to Yom Kippur, because the 40 years of the desert had an elevated status of Kedushat Yom Kippurim. So the Seporno's thought here is the same as the Vilna Gaon's thought regarding the entry into the Kodesh HaKodashim, which is mutar b'chol, meaning Aaron could do it anytime he wanted, provided he followed the Yom Kippur protocol of the goats and all of that ritual. Okay, but now let's move to Rashi's comment. Rashi raises the question at the end of last week's Parsha. So we talk about the dedication of the Mishkan, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, dedication of the Mishkan. And every day a head of a tribe, a Nasi, brought different korbanos, animal offerings, gold, silver, incense, flour. And the Torah repeats it 12 times. Yehuda brought A to Z. And then Yisachar, same thing. It's repeated 12 times. I'll talk about the repetition. This is quite amazing. This is by far the largest repetition in the Torah. People ask, why does the Torah have this extra vav or this extra aleph or this extra thing? Like every little extra thing, we have drashas. Here, over and over and over and over and over and over again. When the Torah could have just said, it could have given us what Shevet Yehuda brought. They were the first one. And then it could have said, and each Nasi brought the same thing. Right? I'll talk about that. But here is what Rashi says. So this took place the beginning of the second year from the Exodus, and it took place the first 12 days of Nisan, meaning every day a Nasi brought. Now, Shevet Levi was not a Nasi that brought this korban. Shevet Levi didn't bring. The reason you have 12 without Levi is because you count Ephraim and Menashe as two. That's 12 without Levi. So when Aaron saw that his tribe was not invited, so to speak, by God to bring a korban, Aaron had chalisha sadas. That means Aaron was depressed. Aaron was saddened because he thought that perhaps because of his participation in the Chet HaEgel, in building the golden calf, he was seen as undeserving and unworthy. All the Nisim, Aaron, quite logically, is, although he's a Kohen, but he's the head, the top Levi. Every Kohen is a Levi. So Aaron would have been the one who would have brought those korbanos, but Shevet Levi was excluded. So Aaron said, the buck stops here. It must be because of me. So Hashem said to him right afterwards, don't feel bad about this. I am giving you a mitzvah that's even more important than the korbanos of the Nisim. You will be given the mitzvah of lighting the menorah. And the Medrash explains, the korbanos of the Nisim were a one-time thing. I mean, this was only brought that year. It was not repeated. The mitzvah of lighting the menorah will last whenever there's a Beis HaMikdash. And interestingly enough, the Ramban says, perhaps there's even a prophetic allusion to the miracle of Hanukkah, which is celebrated by lighting candles. And although you don't need a Kohen to light Hanukkah candles, but the miracle of Hanukkah came through the Kohanim, who were the Chashmonaim. Shelcha gadol mishalahem. Your portion is greater than their portion. Shata madliku meitiv es haneros. You are given the mitzvah of lighting and setting up the candles, and of course, to take the allegory further, the light of the menorah is also symbolic of the light of Torah, the light of Hashem that permeates the world. And you, Aaron, as a Kohen, are a vehicle for the spreading of that light. And that is an eternal gift that is not even limited to a Beis HaMikdash. If you remember the Haftarah, that's going to be the Haftarah of this coming Parsha. We also read it on Chanukah. It overlaps the Haftarah. And it's a vision of the Navi Zechariah. Beautiful, beautiful vision. Zechariah is one of the very last prophets. It's after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. And a small group of Jews returned to Eretz Israel. And it's very, very difficult. Most of the Jews did not return. And they're struggling under foreign domination of Persia at this point. And even though the small group is back in Eretz Israel, many of them feel demoralized. They feel rejected by God. And there are Jews that are engaged in intermarriage and desecration of Shabbos. Again, similar types of problems to what we face. And Zechariah has a glorious vision of 2 olive trees and a big gold menorah. And there are pipes leading from the olive trees, feeding the menorah. And miraculously, oil is flowing from the trees, filling up the lights of the menorah, which then get ignited on their own. And just imagine the oil gets in there and it flames up. And Hashem says in a very immortal pasuk, Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach. You will not achieve victory with your heroism and your strength. Ki im beruchi. It is through my spirit that you will achieve your success in life. And it's the spirit of Hashem that gives us success. And that was symbolized in that vision by the light of the menorah. So it's no accident why Hashem says, your portion is greater than their portion. Your portion represents the light of Hashem that permeates the world and gives strength to those who would otherwise be despondent. That's why a Jew doesn't lose hope, in many, many ways. We're not in a logical... the fact that Jews exist at all is not a logical proposition. This was a problem that Arnold Toynbee faced, right? Arnold Toynbee was a very, very famous British historian, and he wrote a massive work called A Study in History. Now, again, historians have discredited a lot of the work, but at the time, this was one of the classic works in history. And what he did was he analyzed 50 ancient civilizations. Sumerians, Babylonians, Assyrians, all the way through the Romans. And he tried to map the different factors that account for the rise and fall of civilizations. And thus he was able to create a matrix of which factors are conducive to building a civilization and which factors are conducive to destroying a civilization, because he saw common patterns. Really a work of genius, looking at 50 ancient societies. Problem is, his brilliant theory explained 49 out of his 50 groups. It did not explain the Jewish people. Because based on his own theory, there ought not to be Jews in the world. Because he talks about the need for a common territory, the need for a common language. Jews, for a lot of our history, we did not have ownership or even access to Eretz Yisrael. Most Jews did not speak Hebrew. Now, there's a number of the factors that create civilizations didn't exist. So, I'm a lamed zchus, I defend Toynbee. They say Toynbee was an anti-Semite, but I say, listen, if I wrote a 10,000-page book, and the book works out perfectly, except for the Jewish people, I would be pretty, angry at them too. Hey, they ruined my book, right? So I don't blame him so much for his anti-Semitism and the like. But because of this, Toynbee threw up his hands in frustration, symbolically at least, and he said, okay, I consider the Jews a fossilized people, like a fly in amber. Like you'd find a dinosaur fossil, meaning they shouldn't be around at all. And Yaakov Herzog, who's the president of Israel's uncle, Yaakov Herzog, the son of Chief Rabbi Herzog, who at the time, I believe at the time may have been the Israeli ambassador to the UN, a very brilliant person. He was a Talmud Chacham and also very, very learned in a whole variety of disciplines, went into a big debate with Toynbee. Are the Jews a fossilized people? This is called the Herzog-Toynbee debates. You actually can see some old black and white videos on YouTube in Oxford, a lot of American universities, in which Toynbee, defended his thesis that the Jews are a fossilized people, and Herzog tried to argue the Jews are vibrant and very much alive, etc. But here is the thing. There is more than an element of truth in Toynbee's hypothesis, because Toynbee basically made the argument, under the laws of history, there ought not to be a Jewish people. Therefore, the Jewish people are ahistorical. They have no legitimacy within the framework of historical causality. The funny thing about that statement is, he's actually right. There is no logical reason why there ought to be a Jewish people. We're not used to the idea of civilizations disappearing because they tend today not to totally disappear. But in the ancient world, this was pretty common. I mean, think about this. Where are the Assyrians? Where are the Babylonians? Where are the ancient Persians? Where are the ancient Greeks? Where are the ancient Romans? I mean, they're gone. The notion of a whole civilization just kind of disappearing, yeah, I mean, there's probably some genetic fragments mixed in here and there. But as a civilization, they're gone. So the notion that, well, civilizations never really disappear, that's absolutely false. Civilizations certainly disappear. So why shouldn't the Jewish civilization disappear? Makes no sense. So Toynbee's right. Toynbee was a professional historian, and within the laws of history, there should not be an Am Yisrael. So our existence is a miracle. The truth of the matter is, this is one of the, to me at least, one of the most powerful arguments to even prove the existence of God. And that is, the existence of the Jewish people makes sense only if there's a divine creator that gave Am Yisrael a purpose. So as a result, this, going back to Aaron, this is kind of the symbolism of the light of the menorah. You will not achieve success by your strength, by your heroism. You will achieve success only by the light of Hashem that infuses you. And that's the great, great vision of the menorah. Okay. Now, the way Rashi quotes the Medrash, Aaron was simply upset because he was not offered an opportunity to bring a korban with the other Nesiim. And therefore Hashem is communicating to him, I have not rejected you, I have something bigger for you. And that's the menorah. But the Vilna Gaon brings a slightly different Medrash that is actually a bit perplexing. That what upset Aaron was not that Levi didn't bring a korban, but Shevet Ephraim brought a korban on Shabbos. Now, how do we know this? Because keep in mind that if you look at the order of the Nesiim, the seventh korban is the tribe of Ephraim. And we know that the Chanukah Habayis began on Sunday. So day 7 is Shabbos. So Shevet Ephraim brought a korban on Shabbos. So that upset Aaron. When Aaron saw that Shevet Ephraim brought a korban on Shabbos, that upset him, and he needed the reassurance of the mitzvah of the menorah. So the question is, why would that upset him? I mean, I understand. The way Rashi brings the Medrash is very logical. Aaron is upset because he was not given an opportunity to bring a korban, so he quite logically connected it to the rejection because of the Chet HaEgel. So Rashi's understanding is a relatively straightforward understanding. But to simply say that he was somehow upset because Shevet Ephraim brought the korban on Shabbos, why would that upset him? By the way, a little aside, this is a digression. The Vilna Gaon says, how do we know that Shevet Ephraim brought a korban on Shabbos? Maybe Shabbos they didn't bring a korban at all. Because as a matter of pure halachic logic, the korbanot of the Nesiim should in fact not be brought on Shabbos. Why is that so? Because the rule about Shabbos korbanot is the only korbanot that are brought on Shabbos are the communal offerings of the nation, like the daily korban tamid and the musaf offerings. Individual offerings, if I want to bring my burnt offering, my peace offering, I cannot do it on Shabbos. Now the Nesiim are bringing these korbanos as individuals. It's not the korban of the tribe, it's the korban of the Nasi. So as a matter of logic, the korban of the Nasi shouldn't be Docha Shabbos. So how do we know that Shevet Ephraim is number 7, but who says they brought it on Shabbos? Maybe he brought it on Sunday. In other words, the first 6, Sunday to Friday, Shabbos no korban, then they started again the second week. Right? Mehechi Teisi, how do you know Shevet Ephraim brought on Shabbos? So the Vilna Gaon says an ingenious explanation. This is a digression, but it's such a fascinating thought, a tiny bit complicated, that I wanted to share it with you. Hashem said, when he commanded the Nesiim to bring their korbanos, he said, Nasi echad layom, one Nasi per day, one nasi per day. So here's what the Vilna Gaon interprets it. He says, there are going to be 2 days of the week which will only have one nasi bring a korban, but the other 5 days there'll be 2 nasiim bringing korbanos. How is that so? If you posit Shabbos, it works out exactly that way. Week 1, korbanos were brought from Sunday through Shabbos. That's 7. Week 2, there are 5 more. It was Sunday through Thursday. So that means 5 days of the week had 2 nasiim. Meaning, week 1, Sunday, was 1 nasi, and week 2, Sunday, was one nasi. Which days of the week had only 1 nasi bring? Friday and Shabbos. Masha Enkein, if I posit that they didn't bring Karbanos and Shabbos, so that means week 1 was 1 to 6, Sunday to Friday. Week 2 was 1 to 6. So 6 days of the week had 2 Nasiim, and Shabbos had no Nasi. You don't have 2 days where only 1 Nasi brought. So therefore it's Mukhrach that the Nasiim did bring their offering on Shabbos, textually. Therefore, Shevet Ephraim number 7 brought it on Shabbos. That's mamish, an ingenious vort, a little complicated. I hope I made sense in presenting it. But let's go back to the main question, and that is, why would that upset Aaron so much? Why would Aaron be upset that Shevet Ephraim brought the korban on Shabbos? So here, there is a thought from the Sefer Hadrash V'Ha'iyun. This was Rav Aaron Levin, Hashem Yimkam Damo. He was the Rav, Reisha Rav. He was a Rav in Latvia. Very, very chashuv Talmid Chacham, who died in the Holocaust. And he was also a member of the Polish Parliament, which he represented Jewish interests. Those of you who might know or know of the famous Washington attorney, Nathan Lewin, a very good friend of mine for many, many years, and he lives like in Yerushalayim, I think most of the year now, because I think he's largely retired. He is a grandson of Rav Aaron Levin, the Reisha Rav, the Sefer Drash V'Ha'iyun. And the Drash V'Ha'iyun says the following: Aaron is worried about the Chet HaEgel. But here is the thing: Aaron has a certain compensation. Aaron did effectively make the egel by collecting the gold, throwing it into the fire, and the egel emerged. So in terms of deed, Aaron did a pernicious deed. But Aaron's machshava, his thought, was pure. Aaron's thought, the Medrash tells us, was not for Avodah Zarah. Aaron's thought was pure. What was Aaron's thought process? This is a little odd, but the Medrash says this. Aaron knew that a significant segment of the Jewish people had intention to serve Avodah Zarah. And Avodah Zarah is an exception to the normal rule that Hashem only punishes deed and not thought, because Avodah Zarah, God even punishes thought. So the Jewish people would be punished for a thought of Avodah Zarah. But Aaron felt bad because that would discredit God, because for the observers who can't read thoughts are thinking that God is punishing the Jewish people for no reason. So Aaron had a kavanah to kind of give Hashem an open reason to be ma'anish Klal Yisrael by bringing out the thought into action. He gives a mashal, the Vilna Gaon gives a mashal to a faithful servant of a king. And this was a faithful servant who loved the king and always wanted to protect the king. But the king was arbitrary and kind of crazy, maybe a little like Trump in that way. And sometimes if the servant did the smallest thing, the king would say the king would do off with his head. So the servant did a tiny, insignificant thing, and the king ordered his execution. The servant loved the king so much that he took a tureen of hot soup and he dumped it all over the king. How is that an act of love? Because if you're going to kill me, I want to give you a good reason. I don't want people to think of you as a nut. I'm going to give you a legitimate reason. So he says, Aaron knew that so many Jews were chayav misa because of the machshavas avodah zarah, and Hashem punishes machshava k'maisa. But Aaron was afraid that people would think Hashem was unjust, so he wanted to give Hashem a reason. Again, it's a strange argument, but this is stated in the Midrash. The point is, though, that Aaron's machshava was pure, Aaron's maisa was wrong. Now, let's look at Ephraim. Ephraim is the son of Yosef. Now, if you remember Yosef's encounter with Potiphar's wife, so the truth is, at some point, Yosef actually was ready to be with her. His machshava was to do an avera. At the last moment, he refrained. So Yosef and Aaron represent opposites. Aaron had the right thoughts and did the wrong deed. Yosef had the wrong thought, but did the right deed. So which does God focus on? The thought or the deed? So says the Drash Feyoyin, this is what bothered Aaron. When Aaron saw that Shevet Ephraim, who comes from Yosef, was given the special honor, a unique honor, of even being able to bring his korban on Shabbos, even though Yosef was guilty of a bad thought, what is Aaron's conclusion? That God doesn't care about the thought, God only cares about the deed, and Yosef passed. So Aaron now feels bad, because if I see from Shevet Ephraim that the deed is more important than the thought, then I'm in big trouble because of the Chet HaEgel, where my thoughts were pure and my deeds were bad. Because I see from the Shevet Ephraim that the Iker is the deed more than the thought. You see, this is the idea. So this actually explains the Medrash, why it was particularly Shevet Ephraim, Yosef, in other words, that created the consternation, because the defect in Yosef was the opposite of what the defect in Aaron was, and therefore Aaron thought this would be a judgment on him, that he would be punished and rejected for his bad deed, even though he had a positive thought. And therefore Hashem had to reassure him that you're reading too much into this, so to speak. And Shalcha Gadol Mishalahem, you're given the great merit of the menorah and the like. Okay, so this is a little, as they say, pilpulistic, but it's an interesting contrast between Aaron and Yosef. Okay. Now, after the mitzvah of adlakas menorah, there is a ceremony formally designating the Levim. They shave all their hair, they're like newborn babies, etc. And they become designated as the assistants to the Kohanim in all ways. So I want to share with you a Mishnah in Maseches Chulin that emerges from the halachos in this Parsha. The Mishnah says there are certain disqualifications of Kohanim that do not disqualify Levim, and there are certain disqualifications of Levim that do not disqualify Kohanim. A Kohen is disqualified by physical blemish. A Kohen has a broken leg, a broken arm. The same way you cannot bring a korban with a blemish, a Kohen cannot do avoda in the Mishkan or the Beis HaMikdash if there's a blemish. So the psul of a Kohen is mum, but there is no psul of age. There is no mandatory retirement age. For Kohanim, if a Kohen is capable of doing the avoda at 90, he can do so. By Levim, whose job it is to sing and to carry things and the like, they have different jobs. They have jobs as gatekeepers, they have jobs as singers, they have jobs as musicians, they have jobs in terms of carrying the Mishkan and the like. Once there's a Beis HaMikdash, that kind of no longer exists as a function, but they have different tasks. So for Levim, it's the other way around. A Levi is not pasul b'mum. Even if a Levi has a blemish, he could still sing, be a musician, even carry if he's physically able to do so. But a Levi does have a mandatory retirement age. And the age is fairly young, especially from my vantage point, it's really, really young. The Levi starts working at, well, that's another steer. What's the starting point? One pasuk says he starts at 25. The other pasuk says he starts at 30. So Rashi explains there's like a 5-year apprenticeship where he works under somebody's supervision, and then at 30 he can be his own guy, whatever that means exactly. And Chazal derive from there that if you're engaged in some professional activity and you're not successful after 5 years, it's time to move on. By the way, as a little aside, this Chazal is invoked by yeshiva students all the time. They've been in yeshiva for a number of years, and they say, I've been here 5 years, I have not achieved success, time for me to go. So now sometimes that happens to be true, so it's not always, you don't always try to refute it, but if the Rosh Yeshiva wants to refute it, there are two different ways they refute it. One is the warm and fuzzy approach, and the other is the tough love approach. The student says, Chazal say, if you tried hard at something for 5 years and you're not successful, move on. So the tough love approach is, who says you tried? You think what you did counts like trying? Right? So that's the tough love. So it doesn't count. The clock didn't start yet. That's the tough love. The warm and fuzzy says, who says you didn't accomplish? Maybe you didn't accomplish as much as you hoped, but listen, when you came, could you read Rashi, and now you can read Rashi? Hey, you're not a failure. You accomplished something, right? So there are two different ways. You can either attack I put in the effort, or you can say, you can attack the failure idea. Okay, that's the beginning. But the terminus point is age 50. Age 50. When he's 50, he's out. Now, there is a machlokas exactly what is he out for. That's actually a complicated discussion, but there is a mandatory retirement. So the Mishnah in Chulin makes this interesting correlation without explaining it. That which pasels, that which invalidates the Kohen, does not invalidate the Levi, and that which invalidates the Levi does not invalidate the Kohen. The Kohen is invalidated with blemish and not years. The Levi is invalidated with years and not blemish. Now, how we know that is pretty clear. That's just looking at the verses. In other words, it's a very explicit derivation. But the question is there any logic to this? Why exactly do we have different standards for Kohen versus Levi, and what does it signify? So there is actually, this is a bit of a simplification of a much longer thought that is developed by the Alter Rebbe, the Balatanya, Rav Shneur Zalman, of Liadeh, augmented by his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Chabad. The Alter Rebbe wrote, in addition to Tanya, he actually wrote, or not actually, he didn't write it himself, but it was written, his discourses, which are actually much more complicated and deep, are in two Svarim on Chumash. One is Likutei Torah, on Vayikra B'Midbar Devarim, and the other has a different name for some reason, Torah Or and Bereshis and Shmos. Why the Sefer, it's really one Sefer, because Bereshis Shmos, Devarim. Why the Bereshis Shmos has one title and Vayikra B'Midbar Devarim has another title seems to be an accident of printing. They were printed in two different cities, and the printer just gave it a title, and therefore the two different printers happened to choose two different titles, and the different titles were never corrected. But this is in Likutei Torah, and here is what the Alter Rebbe says. The Alter Rebbe says that the Kohen and the Levi represent two different ways of serving Hashem. The Kohen represents serving Hashem by absolute obedience to the letter of the law. If one studies the laws of korbanos, one sees how intricate, how detailed they are. There is no room for creativity. There is no room for innovation. There is no room for spontaneity. You gotta follow the rules. If you deviate from the rules, in many, many cases, the korban will actually be invalid. The whole thing is invalid. I'll give you a very simple example. A Kohen wears a uniform. Kohen Gadol has a different uniform, but the Kohen wears called Big Day Kahuna. Now, a regular Kohen is dressed in white linen garments. In fact, the same way the Kohen Gadol dresses on Yom Kippur, a regular Kohen dresses that way the whole year. So let's say he would like to augment his uniform by putting on a nice tie or scarf. Add a little color to the wardrobe. Looks nicer. Well, there's a principle that if a Kohen does the avodah with an extra garment on himself, or he wears a sweater because it's cold. Remember, the service of the Beis HaMikdash is outdoors, except for menorah in the Heichal, but the korbanos are all outdoors. So it could be raining, it could be very, very cold. The Kohen has to go barefoot. So if he wears socks, or slippers, or a sweater, or a necktie, it doesn't affect the quality of what he's doing. The whole avodah is puzzle. This is called meruba begadim, extra garments, puzzle. I'm using this just as an example that the life of the Kohen is very focused. It's rule specific. It is consistent. It got to be done the same exact way every single day. The world of the Levi is a world of emotion and spontaneity. Because the primary avodah of the Levi, although the Levi has many tasks, but the primary avodah of the Levi is musical accompaniment, both by instrumental music and by vocal singing. Of course, we've lost the actual tunes. Some have suggested that the Gregorian chants might be a partial preservation of what music was like in the Beis HaMikdash, because the Gregorian chants are very ancient, and they may go back to Roman times, and Rome in turn was familiar with what they did in the Beis HaMikdash, and the early Christians were, of course, Jews, and they may have been familiar. So who knows? I have no idea if that's true, but the music was very much part of the service. And by the way, this is a little remez. Why do Reform synagogues call themselves temples? This goes back to the early 19th century because they wanted to have organ music in the service, and they knew that halacha didn't allow musical instruments on Shabbos, at least, but they did know that in the Beis HaMikdash they did play musical instruments even on Shabbos, so they figured by calling their synagogues temples, they would be halachically legitimating the use of musical instruments on Shabbos. So the temple goes along with the organ. Because again, you have to understand, the earliest Reformed synagogues were not officially breaking with Orthodoxy yet. They were trying to claim that they were working within. In fact, well, obviously the term Orthodoxy didn't even exist either. There is no Orthodox until there's Reform. It's a little bit of an anachronism to talk about the Orthodox, but whatever, the halachic way things were. So the original Reform were trying to claim they were within halacha and therefore temple, musical instruments. And by the way, it's interesting that, just as a digression, forgive me for digressing, in Krakow, which was the one city of Poland that largely physically, people were killed, but the buildings survived because it was the capital of Nazi-occupied Poland. And unlike Warsaw, 95% of which was destroyed, both by German bombs and then by Allied bombs, Hans Frank, Yimach Shemo, who was the Nazi governor general of Poland, gave orders that none of the buildings, he didn't care about the people, obviously, but none of the buildings in Krakow should be destroyed. So to this day, Krakow has many, many beautiful Jewish buildings. Many, the synagogues are largely empty. There are some active synagogues, but they're there as museums or whatever it would be. So I remember I was zchus to be in Krakow once, and you see all these different shoals and cemeteries, great gedolim, the Ramah, people going all the way back. Sorishner, the Beis Yaakov of Krakow, first Beis Yaakov. So there's one building in Krakow that's called the Temple. This was the Reform Temple in Krakow. So what's so Reform about it? So you walk in, there's a mechitza, and there's a shas, there's svarim. It looks like a modern Orthodox synagogue, we'll say. So what's Reform about it? Why was it called the Reform Temple of Krakow? Because the rabbi's drasha was given in Polish instead of Yiddish. So in Krakow, that's called Reform already. So Reform meant different things. There was Reform that was real Reform, no kosher, no yarmulkes, no talises. And then there's Reform, which is 100% halacha, but the rabbi spoke in Polish instead of Yiddish. That was so in Poland already. That was called Reform. So Hungary, Germany had a very different definition of Reform. In fact, I myself experienced that in Baltimore. Many years ago, maybe the early 1980s, I gave a Rambam shir in a Hasidic shul. All right, whatever, Sefer HaMitzvos. And after the shir, somebody went over to me and pulled me to the side and said, read this document on the wall. So apparently it was a document from the Chassam Sofer that says it is forbidden for any Rav to give a share in any language other than Hebrew or Yiddish. So he told me, we're supposed to follow that rule in this show. It was whatever it is. So he told me I have a heter. The heter he gave me was, if you don't do it in the shul, if you do it in a side room, it's okay. So he told me I have to.
You were giving it in English.
Huh?
You were giving it in English.
I was giving it in English. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So I was transgressing the Chassam Sofer's hachraza that you can only give a drasha or a shir in a Beis Knesset, only in Yiddish or Hebrew. I think he said maybe only in Yiddish, maybe not even in Hebrew, which has its own problems. But he said the heter would be you can give English shiurim in a side room. Yeah.
I was thinking when you were comparing the Levim with the Kohanim,
Yeah.
the different standards that were applied to each.
Yeah.
Even with Edus, Kosher Edim, there are very different standards. Like I know a bar mitzvah boy cannot be a kosher egg, as far as a will.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, what I was told, because that's my field, they didn't even say 18 or 21. They said it has to be a mature boy. There has to be physical signs of.
Oh, because it's real estate, you mean?
Be a kosher egg.
Well.
18, 21, right?
Yeah, I think, okay, I don't want to get into the details of that. I think those are special halachic rules regarding real estate transactions, meaning it's not a general rule. A 13-year-old can, in fact, be a witness, but there are certain areas where you require a greater level of maturity for certain types of transactions. Okay, well, we can talk about that. Okay, so be it as it may, right? So here is the thing. The Kohen lives the life of rules, and the Levi lives the life of emotion and feeling and spontaneity. I want to point out that although it's true that eventually the Tehillim became the official music of the Beis HaMikdash, but that's not a halachic requirement. In other words, originally, Levim were allowed to improvise. They could bring their own poems. They could bring their own compositions, play their own musical arrangements, right? So it's very different than the Kohen. The Kohen represents the world of rules, and the Levi represents the world of emotion and feeling and spontaneity and creativity. Now, each modality of divine service has its strength and has its weakness. The world of rules has a great strength because it promotes consistency. You see, when you're serving Hashem based on your feelings, based on your inspiration, that may be a wonderful thing, but that comes and goes. There are days you're not so inspired. There are days that you're not so moved. But in the world of rule, listen, I got to daven Shachris, even though I don't feel like it so much. I got to learn Torah, even though I'd rather, go to the beach. You're committed to the rules. So even when you're not inspired, you're going to go on. I mean, I know people like that. You knew people like that. I when I was in Silver Spring, a very dear member of my show was an elderly man. He's not alive anymore. And he grew up in America before there were yeshivas. He didn't really go to yeshiva. But somehow he remained shomer Shabbos all of his life. And he would not miss a minyan for anything. I remember him, there was like 10 inches of snow, and he would be trudging to shul. It would take him like 40 minutes to walk 3 blocks. And he didn't look at it like some supreme sacrifice that he made. This is what you do. A Jew goes to shul. This is it. No chachmas. There was no sophistication to it. Although he happened to be a very intelligent person. In fact, he worked for the CIA, although he never talked about it. But in terms of his emunah, in terms of his basic adherence to halacha, no question. Right? So the maila of the world of rules is that it's consistent. The world of emotion goes up and it goes down. The chisaron of the world of rules is that sometimes your service can get mechanical and superficial. You're just doing the same thing over and over again, and it may lack a passion. In the world of emotion, it's exactly the opposite. The strength of the world of emotion is you bring passion, geschmack, excitement. The downside is, of course, lack of consistency. It comes and goes. So ideally, a Jew needs to combine both of these aspects. I should also add, too, that the downside of the world of emotion is that it tends to become a narcissistic journey towards your own spirituality, in which you're not serving God, but you're feeding your own ego. Makes me feel good, etc. Why do I have to keep all these rules? Now, here's what the Baal HaTanya says. He says, when you're a rule-oriented person, he says, you don't get disqualified by age. Because in a sense, the longer you do it, the more habitual it becomes. Meaning, you're not going to lose that commitment to, just the example I gave you of the 90-year-old person. You're not going to lose the commitment to rule by virtue of age. Because the more you do it, the more it becomes ingrained as your habitual behavior. So that's why the Kohen, who lives in the world of rules, is not disqualified by age. What can disqualify him? Mum, which symbolically can mean physical disability, meaning what's going to stop the guy from going to shul? His physical limitations. At some point, there may be physical limitations that kick in. At that point, it's beyond his control. So that's why the world of the Kohen is limited by physical disabilities, but it's not limited by age, because age only increases a greater commitment to the habits of a lifetime. With the world of emotion, it's exactly the opposite. The big chisaron in the world of emotion is burnout. Meaning, as you get older, you might lose the enthusiasm. That's a serious problem. Right? I see this in myself every day. Or Sameach is a lively crowd. They're always having parties, always going somewhere. Right? If I were fully committed to the social program of my yeshiva, I would be at a wedding every night, and a vort, and a bris, and a pidyon abed. Right? So Baruch Hashem, I'm a little antisocial, so I get myself out of some of these things. But you see, the guys sing and dance and lebedik and passionate. You get older, it's harder to get involved in all of that. In fact, I used to say, I was a Rebbe in Silver Spring for many years, that what is the dividing line between kid and adult? So I suggested the dividing line is, on Simchas Torah, do you try to stop hakafas or do you try to prolong hakafas? This is a perennial fight, right? The old grouchy people, are always trying to stop hakafas, they're going too long. And the young, enthusiastic people always want to keep on going, right? So I remember a time when I would look at those people who want to stop the hakafas, or says, oh, those are the old grouchy people. Now that I've become an old grouchy person, I look at these kids, they have no consideration. So what was always a source of humor to me is that, because I was in the shul for 25 years, I remembered these people as kids who would prolong the hakafas, and I remember them as adults when they would try to stop the hakafas. I says, you've transitioned from enthusiastic kid to a grouchy, not old man, but grouchy middle-aged guy. But that's what happens. So the problem of the world of the Levi is burnout by age. So at a certain age, you're burnt out. You're not capable of the enthusiasm that has to be generated. But physical disability, in some sense, doesn't limit you, because passion, in miraculous ways, can sometimes transcend even your physical limitations. Now, I'm not referring to the Christian things, those probably fake things where the guy in the wheelchair gets up and starts dancing because he's inspired. But the truth is, there is something like that. Intense emotion can give a person a koach to go beyond their physical limitations. So you see, it's a beautiful idea that in the world of rules, age works in your favor, but you'll have physical limitations. In the world of emotion, age can hurt you, but when you're below the age and you still have your passion on fire, the physical limitations don't stop you, right? And that's why the Levi and the Kohen work in two different modalities. Now, ideally, the famous saying of the Sefer Charedim, it's also a beautiful song and the title of a beautiful book, Bilvavi Mishkan Evnech. In my heart, I build a Mishkan, a dwelling place for God. Every one of us is a Beis HaMikdash, a place where God's presence rests. So in a sense, here's the thing. Every one of us is a Beis HaMikdash, or a Mishkan. Just as the Mishkan needed both the Kohen and the Levi, in the construction of our own Mishkan, we have to incorporate the Kohen and the Levi. We have to incorporate, number one, an absolute firm commitment to follow God's rules, whether we're inspired or not, and not to ignore something because we don't think it inspires us. Follow the rules. Be a Kohen. Do your job. But at the same time, we can't allow ourselves to become passionless, dry, mechanical, superficial. We have to do it with joy and with passion and with excitement. The world of the Levi. So we build our Mishkan by combining the Kohen and the Levi, because the Mishkan needs the Kohen and the Levi in order for the Avodah to be complete. Right? So this is a thought we need to think about. That and it's hard sometimes, because sometimes you'll find that people are so fixated on rules that they somehow don't bring their heart to their avodah. And sometimes people who seem to bring their heart to the avodah have an impatience with the rules. They don't understand how the rules help them. One is the Levi without the Kohen. One is the Kohen without the Levi. You got to combine them. So, wish you a wonderful week and a good Shabbos. Thank you.
Yeah.